On February 26, 2022, just 48 hours after Russian forces entered Ukraine, the United States and Europe executed a financial strike unlike anything seen in modern geopolitics. They announced that major Russian banks would be disconnected from SWIFT, the global messaging network that links more than 11,000 financial institutions across over 200 countries. SWIFT doesn't store money and it doesn't move money, but it carries the messages that make international transactions possible, over $5 trillion worth every day. Cutting Russia off meant one thing: no smooth international payments, no access to global finance, a wall between Russia and world trade. Western leaders called it the economic nuclear option. Analysts predicted Russia's financial collapse. The ruble would implode, banks would fail, public unrest would force political change. But something completely unexpected followed. Russia didn't collapse. Its currency rebounded. Its trade routes reorganized instead of disappearing. And dozens of nations quietly took notes. Because if the US and Europe could remove Russia from the world's financial bloodstream, they could do it to any country, and just like that, a global shift began. Nations started building alternatives, new payment systems, new reserve strategies, new alliances because trust in the old system had been shaken. This wasn't the first time financial power was used as a weapon. In fact, history shows this pattern has repeated for more than a century, and every time the same outcome unfolds. The dominant power fires the financial weapon and accelerates its own decline. This documentary reveals those historical parallels, the repeating 5-stage cycle, the data showing it's already unfolding today, and why the next 20 years may redefine global monetary power. Before we can understand how the 2022 sanctions backfired, we need to understand what SWIFT truly does and why disrupting it is so powerful. SWIFT is not a bank. It doesn't hold deposits. It doesn't transfer physical money. SWIFT is simply a secure messaging network that allows banks around the world to communicate payment instructions. When a bank in New York wants to send funds to a bank in Tokyo, SWIFT sends the authenticated message that authorizes the transaction. The money moves through correspondent banking channels, but the communication layer is SWIFT's domain. Created in 1973 by a coalition of international banks, SWIFT replaced older, error-prone systems like Telex. It standardized the language of global finance, made settlement faster, and built encrypted rails that the world quickly adopted. By the late 1970s, it handled millions of messages annually. By the 2020s, it processed over 40 million messages every single day, making it the nervous system of international money movement. And here's the hidden leverage. Although SWIFT is based in Belgium and branded as neutral, its infrastructure relies heavily on US and European banking systems, especially the American dollar clearing network in New York. If the US Treasury designates a bank as sanctioned, SWIFT is effectively forced to disconnect them. If your institution loses access to SWIFT, you are functionally cut off from global commerce. You can't easily settle imports. You can't receive foreign payments. You lose the oxygen of international trade. That's why SWIFT became the West's most feared economic weapon, a tool capable of isolating nations without firing a shot. And for years, it worked exactly as intended. To understand why weaponizing SWIFT was so risky, we have to look back at the first major case of financial infrastructure being used as a geopolitical weapon. The year was 1914. Before World War I erupted, Britain sat at the center of global finance. The British pound was the world's reserve currency, London was the universal banking hub, and most international reserves were held in British institutions. But when the war began, Britain made a radical decision. It passed laws allowing the government to freeze German assets, businesses, bank accounts, shipping fleets, and properties throughout the British Empire. This shattered a long-standing principle. Even in wartime, nations honored financial contracts. Money and credit were considered separate from battlefield conflict. By seizing German wealth, Britain gained an immediate wartime advantage. But it also sent a shockwave to every neutral country watching. If Britain could confiscate German holdings today, what stopped them from seizing any foreign nation's assets tomorrow? What if Britain disagreed with their politics, their alliances, their trade decisions? Suddenly, London didn't look like a safe place to store national wealth. After the war, neutral nations quietly shifted their reserves elsewhere. They diversified into gold. They opened accounts in New York and Paris. They reduced dependence on the British system. And the consequences were enormous. Within a few decades, London's grip on global finance weakened. The pound lost international dominance, and by 1944 the US dollar officially replaced it as the world's reserve currency. Britain believed it was exercising ultimate leverage in 1914, but it was actually lighting the fuse of its own financial decline. This was the first clear example of the pattern. When a dominant power weaponizes financial infrastructure, the world reacts by building alternatives. And once those alternatives exist, the original system never regains its monopoly. Fast forward to 1979, a year that reshaped the global financial landscape in ways few recognized at the time. After the Iranian Revolution and the hostage crisis, the United States responded with an unprecedented economic move. It froze Iran's assets held in American banks, billions of dollars in deposits, securities, and government funds. On paper, this was a straightforward retaliation. Iran had seized American citizens, so the US would seize Iranian money. The pressure worked in the short term. It weakened Iran's financial position and contributed to negotiations that eventually secured the hostages' release. But just like Britain in 1914, the US unintentionally sent a much broader message to the world. Nations, especially in the Middle East, realized something disturbing. Reserves held in the United States could be frozen instantly, not through war, not through courts, but by a single presidential order. The implication was clear. Your wealth wasn't truly yours if it was stored in a country that could weaponize access to it. In the following decade, oil-producing states and emerging economies took action. They diversified out of US dollar reserves. They built relationships with European and Asian banks. They increased gold holdings. They spread their assets across multiple jurisdictions to avoid dependence on a single political system. The US won the tactical confrontation with Iran, but it paid a strategic price. From the early 1980s onward, the dollar's share of global reserves began its slow, steady decline. Not because the US economy weakened, but because trust had been shaken. The world had learned a new lesson. Even America was willing to use financial power as a geopolitical weapon. And once a system shows it can be weaponized, countries begin searching for alternatives. This was the second major case of the pattern repeating. A powerful nation gains short-term leverage, while unknowingly encouraging the world to diversify away from its financial dominance. The third major signal came in 2014 after Russia annexed Crimea. For the first time, the US and Europe imposed targeted financial sanctions that restricted certain Russian banks and officials from using Western systems. But they stopped short of removing Russia from SWIFT. To Washington, this was a calibrated response. Enough pressure to punish, but not enough to destabilize global markets. But to Moscow, it was a flashing red warning sign. The United States was fully willing to use financial tools as leverage, and Russia could easily be isolated in the future. So Russia spent the next 8 years preparing. They drastically reduced their exposure to the US dollar, cutting holdings of US Treasury bonds from over $130 billion to nearly nothing. They doubled their gold reserves, increasing physical holdings that couldn't be frozen. They created SPFS, their own domestic financial messaging network. A smaller but functional alternative to SWIFT, they negotiated new trade arrangements with China, India, and other partners that allowed payments in yuan, rubles, and local currencies instead of dollars. And while many Western analysts dismissed these steps as symbolic, Russia was quietly building the infrastructure needed to survive, exactly the kind of sanctions that would arrive in 2022. The sanctions of 2014 slowed Russia economically, but they also offered Moscow something much more valuable: time. Time to reroute trade, time to restructure reserves, time to build parallel systems. By attempting to punish Russia without fully severing ties, the West unintentionally gave Russia 8 years to prepare for a scenario in which the US would fully weaponize SWIFT. This was the third repetition of the historical pattern. The dominant power demonstrates its willingness to weaponize finance, and the target nation begins constructing alternatives long before the next confrontation arrives. Then came February 2022, the moment everything that had been building for a century finally converged. Just 2 days after Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine, the United States and its European allies executed the most aggressive financial strike in modern history. They disconnected major Russian banks from SWIFT and froze roughly $300 billion of Russia's foreign reserves held in Western institutions. This wasn't a targeted sanction. This wasn't symbolic pressure. This was the full-scale financial equivalent of severing a nation from the global bloodstream. The immediate shock was dramatic. The ruble plummeted. Foreign investors fled. Russians lined up at ATMs, fearing their savings would evaporate. Economists around the world predicted Russia wouldn't last more than a few months. For a brief moment, it looked like the West had just demonstrated ultimate financial dominance. But what happened next defied almost every prediction. Russia absorbed the initial blow, stabilized its currency, redirected its energy exports to Asia, and began relying heavily on alternative payment channels, especially China's financial infrastructure. Trade continued, but now it flowed through non-Western systems. The sanctions didn't collapse Russia, they accelerated its shift away from the dollar-based order. Yet the even bigger shock wasn't Russia's resilience, it was the global reaction. Countries across Asia, Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East watched the asset freeze and SWIFT cutoff, and asked themselves a new existential question. If the US can freeze Russia's reserves, could they freeze ours someday? It didn't matter whether these nations supported Russia or not. What mattered is that trust in the old system was fractured. The world had now seen, unmistakably, that the US and Europe were willing to use the core of global finance as a geopolitical weapon. And once that line was crossed, the global order began to shift. This was the moment the pattern repeated for the fourth time, and arguably, the moment it accelerated faster than ever before. The shock wasn't just to Russia. It was to the entire global financial architecture, and it triggered the beginning of a rapid, irreversible transition toward alternatives. What happened after 2022 wasn't random. It followed a pattern the world has seen every time a major financial power weaponizes its system. A 5-stage cycle that has repeated for more than a century and is unfolding again right now. Stage 1. The dominant power controls the system. For decades, the US effectively oversaw the world's financial plumbing. Not by owning SWIFT, but by controlling dollar clearing, Western banking infrastructure, and the legal frameworks that SWIFT depends on. If most global transactions rely on dollars, and the US controls access to dollars, then the US indirectly controls the entire system. Stage 2. The system is weaponized for political goals after 9/11s. Sanctions became a core tool of US foreign policy. What began as counterterrorism expanded into pressure campaigns against Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, and eventually Russia. By 2022, using SWIFT as a weapon felt like an obvious extension of the tools that had already been normalized. Cutting Russia off wasn't a surprise, it was the culmination of 2 decades of escalating financial coercion. Stage 3. Targeted countries build alternatives. Russia couldn't rely on Western systems, so it pivoted to anything that wasn't controlled by the US or Europe. It used China's CIPS network, scaled its domestic SPFS system, settled energy sales in yuan, rupees, and dirhams, and turned to barter-style trade when necessary. Within 2 years, a huge share of its international commerce was being processed outside the dollar-based system entirely. Stage 4. Neutral countries start hedging their bets. This is the phase that truly changes the world. Nations that were not sanctioned, Saudi Arabia, India, Brazil, the UAE, Turkey, Indonesia, began reducing dollar exposure, buying record amounts of gold, testing alternative payment channels, and forming new trade partnerships that bypass the Western system. They weren't rejecting the US. They were protecting themselves from the possibility that they could be targeted next. This is the point where a financial weapon starts weakening the very system that once made it powerful. Stage 5. The weapon loses its effectiveness. Once enough countries have built alternatives, the original system no longer has the same leverage. SWIFT still exists, the dollar still dominates, but their monopoly fades. And once a monopoly is gone, it rarely returns. By the mid-2020s, the world had entered this final stage. The SWIFT weapon still exists on paper, but using it again would have far less impact, because the countries most likely to be targeted now have fallback systems ready. This 5-step cycle has repeated with Britain, with the United States in 1979, with Russia in 2014, and now on a global scale after the 2022 sanctions. And each time, the same outcome emerges. The dominant power weakens its own financial foundation by demonstrating exactly how it can be used against others. This isn't speculation, it isn't theory. The numbers now show clearly and unmistakably that the global financial system has already started to move away from dollar-centric infrastructure. Russia's trade transformation before sanctions. Almost 90% of Russia's international trade was settled in dollars or euros. Just a few years later, roughly 40% of that trade now runs on non-Western currencies: yuan, rubles, rupees, dirhams, and more. Its trade with China alone skyrocketed to new highs, with most settlement now occurring in yuan and rubles. Russia proved that a major economy can function almost entirely outside the traditional system. China's financial rails are scaling at record speed. China's CIPS network, the closest alternative to SWIFT, has grown at an explosive pace. In a few short years, its annual transaction volume more than doubled, reaching tens of trillions of dollars and connecting financial institutions in over 100 countries. CIPS is still smaller than SWIFT, but its growth rate is significantly faster. It is no longer a niche system. It is becoming a parallel financial highway that countries can use when they don't want their payments running through New York or Brussels. Central banks are buying gold at 50-year highs for 3 consecutive years. Central banks around the world have purchased over 1,000 tons of gold annually, the strongest and most sustained buying spree since the 1970s collapse of Bretton Woods. Why? Because gold cannot be frozen. It cannot be sanctioned. It cannot be blocked by another country's legal system. When nations lose trust in fiat currencies, they increase gold holdings, and today's surge tells us trust in the US-led system is weakening. The decline of the dollar's reserve share at the turn of the century, the dollar made up more than 70% of global reserves. Today, that share has fallen toward the upper 50s, a drop worth trillions of dollars. And more importantly, the speed of decline has accelerated sharply since 2022. A similar trend is visible in trade settlement. The dollar's dominance has slipped double digits in just a few years. Bilateral currency deals are expanding everywhere. China now has currency swap agreements with dozens of nations worth hundreds of billions. India settles growing volumes of trade in rupees. The UAE and Brazil trade directly without dollars. BRICS countries are designing joint payment systems and exploring commodity-backed currencies. The world isn't waiting for a new system. It's building one. The petrodollar is no longer a monopoly. For nearly half a century, oil was traded exclusively in dollars. That monopoly is now broken. Saudi Arabia accepts yuan for energy sales. Russia sells oil to India in rupees. The UAE uses dirhams. Iran uses yuan for Chinese exports. Other producers are preparing similar agreements. Once the exclusivity is gone, the structural demand for dollars begins to erode permanently. All of these numbers point in the same direction. The shift away from sin-dominated finance is not a future event. It is happening right now, and it is accelerating faster than at any point in modern history. The consequences of this global shift aren't abstract. Some nations gain tremendous strategic advantages, while others face long-term structural challenges as the financial landscape becomes multipolar. Who gains power? China. China emerges as the biggest winner. It has the manufacturing scale, the trade networks, the digital payment ecosystem, and now the growing currency infrastructure to become the world's next financial anchor. As the dollar's dominance erodes, the yuan steadily grows in influence. China doesn't need a sudden takeover, it only needs the dollar to weaken over time. That process has already begun. Russia gains something different: strategic resilience. By surviving the most aggressive sanctions ever attempted, Russia proved that a major economy can operate outside US-controlled systems. This demonstration effect changed global thinking. It showed other nations that alternatives aren't theoretical, they are viable. BRICS nations and emerging economies, countries like India, Brazil, South Africa, and new BRICS members such as Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, and Iran all gain greater autonomy. They can balance relations between East and West, choose the most favorable payment rails, and avoid reliance on a single geopolitical power. A world with multiple financial centers gives rising economies more leverage than ever before. Gold and alternative payment systems, non-dollar systems, CIPS, SPFS, regional payment networks, become more attractive as trust in Western dominance declines. Digital payment technology accelerates this shift, making alternatives easier to adopt than at any previous point in history. Who faces new challenges? The United States. The US doesn't collapse, but it loses the extraordinary privileges that come from issuing the world's primary reserve currency. When fewer countries need dollars, US borrowing becomes more expensive. Sanctions become less effective. Living standards, inflated by decades of cheap imports, begin to normalize. Financial dominance fades not with a crash, but with a slow, steady erosion of influence. Europe tied its financial future tightly to the US system by aligning fully with the 2022 sanctions. It linked its own economic security to the fortunes of the dollar. As the world diversifies away from the dollar, Europe doesn't automatically gain ground. China does. SWIFT won't disappear, but it will no longer be the unquestioned standard for global financial messaging. Its influence shrinks each time a new nation integrates with CIPS, each time BRICS expands its payment system, and each time a trade deal bypasses Western banks entirely. Holders of dollar assets. Those with dollar-denominated savings or long-term U.S. bonds may face declining real value as the dollar gradually loses purchasing power relative to commodities and alternative currencies. The winners are those who diversify, adapt, and build new systems. The losers are those who depended on a world that no longer exists. The events of 2022 didn't break the global financial system overnight, but they marked the exact moment the world began transitioning away from a single currency monopoly. Historians will look back on this period as the turning point when the dollar-centric era started giving way to a multipolar financial order. A timeline already in motion. In 1914, Britain weaponized its financial power. 30 years later, the pound lost its reserve status. In 2022, the United States used the full weight of SWIFT and reserve freezes against Russia. And the same pattern has been triggered once again, only this time technology accelerates everything. Alternative systems scale in months, not decades. Digital currencies spread instantly. Cross-border payment platforms grow exponentially. That means the transition won't take 50 years. It may take 15 to 25. The dollar won't disappear, but it will no longer dominate the way it once did. What the next decades look like by the 2030s, the dollar's share of global reserves could fall near 50%. By the 2040s, it may settle around 35 to 40%, still significant, but no longer hegemonic. The world will shift to multiple major currencies: dollars, euros, and gold-backed instruments competing and coexisting. Nations will rely on diverse payment rails. Not just SWIFT. Sanctions will lose much of their force. U.S. deficits will become harder to finance. Living standards will adjust as the free lunch of unlimited borrowing begins to fade. This isn't collapse. It's normalization. The United States becomes a powerful nation among several, not the unquestioned financial center. The lesson of 2022 financial weapons work once. Only once. After the world watches them being used, countries fortify their defenses, build new systems, and diversify their reserves. By cutting Russia off from SWIFT and freezing its sovereign assets, the West unintentionally revealed the single greatest vulnerability of the global system: dependence on a structure controlled by one country. And once nations recognized that vulnerability, they began reorganizing the global economy at unprecedented speed. The new era. The shift won't happen with a dramatic crash, but with a slow, steady rebalancing, a quiet rewiring of global finance. A world where no single nation can dictate the rules for everyone else. The post-dollar world isn't here yet, but the path toward it has already been set. And future historians will likely agree, February 2022 was the moment. The old financial order began its irreversible transformation.